Hello and welcome to Enjoy English School.
欢迎来到 Enjoy 英语学院
I'm Stevie.
And I'm Laurie.
Today we're looking at part 2 of our culture lesson, Role-Playing Games, or RPGs, Questing for Adventure. Yesterday, we talked about how role-playing games kind of started out and became what today we call MMOs. Huge online games with lots of players playing characters. Well, today we're going to talk about how RPGs or role-playing games, how they started, what they started as.
所以呢，我们在这个昨天的文化之窗谈论到了这个文章呢，中文的标题是 RPG 勇闯虚拟冒险国度。那讲到了单人的 RPG， 然后呢如何起源，然后有哪些经典的代表作，到了多人的，以及到我们这个 Stevie 老师跟我们分享了 MMO 大型的多人线上的这种 RPG。那今天呢就要来看到另外一种角度去切入，而且呢会看到一款很有趣的游戏，叫做龙与地下城，我们赶快跟着 Stevie 老师一起来看看吧。
Okay, before we look at the first paragraph, our culture lesson started yesterday, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the subtitle of yesterday's lesson, it said from the computer screen to the tabletop. 我们就是要讲这个范围。
范围
范围。
Okay.
Thank you, Teacher Laurie. Yesterday, we talked about computer screens and on games. Today, we're going to talk about games on the tabletop.
Wow.
Yes.
所以呢，这边讲到的是我们昨天在文章里头有一个 subtitle 讲到从电脑荧幕到桌面那这其实有一点像是我们讲的电玩到桌游这样子的一个概念啦所以今天就会要进入这个 tabletop 的部分。
Right. Long before there were video games,Lots of kids grew up sitting around tables and pretending they were great warriors and wizards, battling evil monsters. Okay, so a long time before there was video games, computer games, cell phone games, a lot of kids grew up sitting around a table and pretending that they were great warriors. They were big, great fighters, soldiers, and wizards. They had magic, and they were battling or fighting evil monsters.
所以呢，我们来看到第一句讲到说 long before 什么什么什么，就是在什么之前很久的时间。所以呢 long before there were video games 就是呢，在有这个电玩游戏之前出现之前，早在这个时间之前呢许多的孩子们呢，他们是 grew up doing something， 就是在做什么事情长大的那做什么事情后面我们的动词加 ing， 所以你看到这边有两件事 grew up sitting around tables， 坐在呢桌子的周围围着桌子坐，然后呢 pretending they were 什么什么什么，假装他们是伟大的战士以及巫师跟邪恶的怪物作战者，他们是这样长大的，就是这个句子的意思。
They did it with pencils, paper, a handful of dice, and the power of their imagination. So this says they did it. They played this game. They battled these evil monsters with pencils and paper, a handful of dice, like dice in your hand, and the power of their imagination. There were no pictures, there was no moving, there was no cartoon.
No graphics.
And we didn't draw the graphics. The pencil and paper were to keep numbers. So you could write down what was happening and keep your characters, their skills and everything written down. Yes. And you would roll the dice, and the story was never set. The story was never 没有一个肯定的. It changed every time with different people.
OK， 所以呢，接下来他讲到 they 是指 lots of kids， 这些小孩子们呢 did it 怎么做到这件事情的呢？就是前一句讲的这些玩这样子的一个桌上的游戏呢，他们是用这个笔，然后呢纸，然后一把的 a handful of 就一把一些这个骰子，以及他们的想象力。
These kids, they probably also owned or had a copy of the Dungeons and Dragons rulebook, first published in 1974. So there was a rulebook of a game called Dungeons and Dragons, and that's how it all started in 1974.
哇哦！所以呢，接下来讲到 they 就是指这些小孩子们呢，他们也可能有一本owned 是有的意思 ，a copy of 就是有一份有一本呢，这个这个时候这是游戏的名称，所以你看它斜体字，而且第一个字母大写那这个中文翻出叫《龙与地下城》的这个 rule book 规则书，而且是怎么样的规则书呢？逗号后面告诉我们是于1974年首度出版的《龙与地下城》的这个规则书。
Okay, we'll take a quick break and come back and talk about what Dungeons and Dragons is. All right, looking at the next paragraph. Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D, was first designed as a simple combat game using dice, small figures, and a paper map, which represented a dungeon. So, D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, it was in the very beginning, it was just designed as a simple game. You had dice to decide what to do. You had small little figures that you played with, little game characters, and you had a paper map, which was a dungeon. It represented a dungeon.
所以呢，接下来讲到这款游戏其实它照着英文的顺序应该是地下城与龙不过我们中文是龙与地下城，然后或者是简称 D&D 呢，它则是被首度的一开始它被设计的呢是 as a simple combat game 就是一个很简单的格斗战斗游戏那么用了这个骰子，然后呢小人偶以及一份纸本的地图那怎么样的纸本地图呢？逗号后面继续补充了，也就是那个代表了地下城的这个纸本地图。
Interestingly, players began adding drama to the game by acting out scenes, pretending to be the characters they picked. So, in the beginning, this game, you had these characters.And you would decide, you had the dungeon, and then the dungeon master, he would tell you what was in the dungeon. And what are you going to do? Okay, I'm going to fight him with magic, or I'm going to fight the monster with a sword. And you would roll the dice and see how successful you were. Well, the game, it left a lot to the imagination, right? It made you think about things. So people began creating stories and characters in their heads. And the game changed. So it says, interestingly, players began adding drama to the game. How did they do this? They started acting out scenes. Okay, I, Conan the Barbarian, take out my giant broadsword.And I swing at the monster troll. And they started acting out these games.
Wow.
And, pretending to be the characters that they picked. It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun to watch too.
Yeah.
所以呢，接下来他讲到说，有趣的是interestingly， 那么呢 ，players 玩家们呢，他们开始呢add drama to something， 就是为某个东西呢开始增添戏剧的这种效果所以他们为这个 to the game， 他们为了这个游戏开始增添戏剧效果，怎么做呢？ by 后面告诉我们 acting out scenes 是指那个一幕一幕的场景游戏里的场景呢，他们把它 acting out 把它演出来，用这个方法来这个增加游戏的戏剧效果。那逗号的后面继续补充说明，而且是装作是他们所这个选的角色，所以扮演成他们所选的角色，然后把这个游戏里的场景演出来，用这个方法。
Yep. Later versions of the game expanded on this. So later versions, they started expanding on people's creativity. You know, they started adding people's ideas to the game. So later versions expanded on this and created more character options. Maybe in the beginning you had a warrior, a wizard, a thief, an elf.You know, something like that. And the game just started expanding. It started getting bigger and bigger with people's ideas.
所以接下来的这一段他一开始就讲到说，而后来的这个版本of the game， 这个 game 当然就是 D&D 所以 D&D 的这个龙与地下城的这个后来的版本呢，它就 expanded on this。 expand 是扩张的意思， on this 这个 this 指的就是这一点哪一点？就是刚刚前面讲的人们开始演出就是增加这个戏剧效果，用演的方式。那么在这一点上面，游戏后代的版本开始呢做扩张，而且创造出更多的角色的 options 选项。
Now, like right now, D&D offers a simple set of rules and a few suggestions.So there's still some simple rules, and there are some suggestions on things you could do.
所以呢，接下来讲到，所以到了现在呢 ，D&D 它会提供一套或者你讲一组简单的这个规则以及一些的建议。
Yeah. However, the story is entirely up to the players.Especially the Dungeon Master, who is the primary storyteller and referee. Again, this sentence seems a little difficult. It's actually not very hard. The story is entirely up to the players, or we could say it's completely up to the players. What this means is the players create the story.
They decide.
Yeah, they decide. It's up to them.And it's especially up to the Dungeon Master. And the Dungeon Master in D&D, he's called the DM. Dungeon Master. Yeah, the DM. So the Dungeon Master, the DM, he is the primary storyteller. He's the main storyteller and referee.
好的，所以
Do you know what a referee is in sports?
裁判。
Yeah. So he's the one, when he tells you what situation you're in, then the players, they react. They say, I'm going to chop off his head. And so the dungeon master rolls the dice and says, you missed. Or you got him, or you only hurt him. And then what do you do now? And so the story continues. And he's the referee. He's the one who decides, yep, it worked. Nope, it didn't. You have to do something else. Or you're dead, sorry.
He's also like a host.
Yeah, he's the host,
kind of.
But he's the main storyteller. The ideas for the story come from his head. So a DM, a dungeon master, has to be a very creative storyteller.
With a lot of imagination.
Yep.
OK， 所以呢，接下来他讲到，然而虽然 D&D 有提供了简单的规则跟一些建议，然而呢，这个故事则是完全由这个玩家们来决定，叫做 is up to the players 由玩家来决定，尤其是那位这个我们讲的地下城主就是这个 DM 呢，他呢也是主要的这里的 primary 就是或者刚刚 Stevie 老师讲的 main M-A-I-N 这个主要的故事的叙述者以及裁判，所以就是由他来决定大部分的故事。
So in this game, together, friends craft unique, exciting adventures, all while exercising their imagination and social skills. So together, you and your friends create, you craft, you create something, you make something. Unique, that means one of a kind. Mm-hmm. Exciting adventures. And while you're doing this, you're exercising your imagination and your social skills. You're getting closer with your friends. You're learning how to communicate more with your friends.
所以呢，他最后讲到说，这个共同的，那么一块儿的，这样叫做 together。那么 friends 朋友们呢，大家一起呢，就来 craft， 就是指创造出、制造出、做出了独一无二是 unique，exciting 是刺激的这个冒险的故事这个冒险。然后呢，全部都是他们呢在使用着他们的，这里的 exercising 不是运动指的是使用、运用他们的想象力以及他们的社交技巧的情况下，然后呢一起来创造出来的。
Okay, we're going to take one more quick break and then look at the last part of the article. Okay, looking at part 3. Dungeons and Dragons is the predecessor of all modern RPGs, including digital role-playing games. When we say Dungeons and Dragons is the predecessor, now whenever we see P-R-E, pre or pre, it means before.
没错，就是前。
Yeah, like prequel, movie prequel.
前传。
Yeah. So, in other words, this was the beginning. This was before all of the modern games. This was what started it. So Dungeons and Dragons is the predecessor of all modern RPGs, all the ones we have now, including the digital ones, the computer games and the cell phone games.
所以呢，他最后来讲到说了，这个龙与地下城呢是这个先驱那什么的先驱呢 ？Oft 后面告诉我们，所有现代 RPG 的先驱，包含了数位的角色扮演游戏。
These days, there are countless RPGs set in fantastical worlds just waiting to be discovered by a group of adventurous friends. So it's saying now there are countless of these RPG games. They're unlimited. There's no end to them. There's so many, you can't count them. And these RPGs are set in fantastical, like fantasy worlds. And they're just waiting for you and your friends to discover them and go have an adventure together.
所以呢，接下来他讲到说了，那么到了现今，到了现在呢，有无数的数不完的，没办法数的，叫做 countless 的这个 RPG 的游戏呢，是被设定在这里的 set， 注意它不是原型它是 PP 过去分词所以才不会你说怎么前面有 there are 的 are， 这里又跑出一个 set 来那么被设定在这个虚幻的世界里头，就等待着被一群有冒险精神的朋友们来发现。
All right, now we are going to take a quick break and come back with a little review for you. It's time for a little review. Just a little one. Now, I mentioned PRE for predecessor, and we talked about that being the beginning of something.
Or before.
Before something. There's another word we used here with what's called the suffix, S-U-F-F-I-X. It's the end of a word. And we saw the word countless. Whenever you see the word less, L-E-S-S, at the end of a word, that means there's like no stopping it. Like countless means there's no counting it because there's too much. So we could say limitless. There's no limit. If something is bottomless, like a bottomless hole in the ground, there's no bottom. It keeps going forever. Another word, hairless.
Ouch.
If you're bald, you have no hair. Oh, that's a hairless cat. It means no hair. So it means no or no limit. It's a good one to know.
That's right. 所以这里的话呢，是我们讲到了 countless 这个字来，然后 Stevie 老师呢告诉我们一些字尾是 less， 它不管是是指没有的意思或者是没办法。所以呢，我们刚刚介绍了 countless 或者是像 limitless 就是无限的、没有限的那或者是像 bottomless 就是没有底的，或者是刚刚最后讲的那个 hairless 就是没有头发的或没有毛发的。
Yeah. So at the end of a word, less it just means no end to that. Okay, that's all the time we have for today. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.